China processes 14.75 million barrels of crude oil every single day. That's enough to fill over 1,000 Olympic swimming pools every single day. You heard that right. And by 2026, China controls nearly 50% of all of Asia's refining capacity. Not through luck, not through geography, through a 25-year campaign so deliberate, so methodical, that by the time the rest of the world noticed, it was already too late to compete. Here's exactly how it happened. The Afterthought Nation Cast. Your mind back to the year 2000. The United States, Western Europe, and Japan together controlled nearly half of the entire world's refining capacity. These were the giants, the undisputed masters of turning raw crude into the fuel that powered civilization. China, by comparison, was barely a footnote. Its refineries were aging, inefficient Soviet-era holdovers. Its domestic fuel demand was modest. And when the world's energy analysts drew their maps of global refining power, China didn't even register as a serious player. It was, by every measurable standard, an afterthought. But here's what nobody was watching closely enough. Inside Beijing, a very different conversation was happening. China's leadership had started doing the math, and the math was terrifying. A nation of over 1 billion people, accelerating toward industrialization at a speed history had never seen before, was almost entirely dependent on foreign refineries to process the fuel it needed to grow. Every barrel of gasoline, every liter of diesel, every drop of jet fuel had to pass through someone else's infrastructure before it reached Chinese soil. And in the minds of the men running Beijing, that wasn't an energy policy. That was a vulnerability. So they made a decision that would quietly reshape the entire global energy order. China would not just build more refineries. It would build dominance. But this was just the beginning of a problem far bigger than anyone in the West anticipated. The challenge wasn't just capital, though. The scale of investment required was staggering. The real challenge was speed. China didn't have decades to gradually expand its refining base the way the United States had in the 20th century. It needed capacity, and it needed it fast. So, Beijing did something that no Western energy market would ever permit. It deployed state power as an industrial weapon. State-owned enterprises like Sinopec and PetroChina were handed mandates, not suggestions. Build, scale, integrate, and do it faster than any refinery build-out in history. What followed wasn't a construction program. It was a mobilization. Within a single decade, China went from processing roughly 6 million barrels per day to smashing past 10 million. Refineries that would have taken 15 years to permit, fund, and construct in the United States were being brought online in 5. Entire industrial zones were redesigned around refining and petrochemical clusters. The government didn't wait for market signals to justify investment. It created the market signals itself. And every facility that came online made the next one easier, cheaper, and faster to build. By the time the global energy industry turned its full attention to what China had quietly constructed, the gap was already insurmountable. The afterthought had become the architect. And what China built wasn't just a collection of fuel factories. It was something the world had never seen before at this scale. Because these weren't ordinary refineries. And once you understand what China actually built inside those complexes, you'll realize the fuel story is only half of it, not refineries. Monsters. When most people picture an oil refinery, they picture one thing: fuel. Crude goes in, gasoline and diesel come out. That's the mental model the Western world built its entire energy infrastructure around: specialized facilities, optimized for one output, running at maximum efficiency. It's a perfectly logical system. And it's exactly why the West never saw China coming. Because China didn't build refineries. It built something fundamentally different. The complexes China constructed, particularly the massive integrated facilities that began coming online through the 2010s, were designed from the ground up to do two things simultaneously. Yes, they process crude into gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel, but in the same facility, using the same feedstocks, running through the same integrated pipeline systems, they also produce the plastics, fertilizers, synthetic fibers, and chemical feedstocks that modern civilization depends on to manufacture virtually everything else. Think about what that means for a moment. Every plastic component in your phone, every synthetic fabric in your clothing, every fertilizer that grew the food on your plate, the raw chemical building blocks for all of it flow out of the same Chinese mega complexes that also fuel Asia's vehicles, factories, and power plants. China didn't just position itself as an energy processor. It positioned itself as the upstream supplier of materials embedded in the global manufacturing chain. But the real tension isn't just what these facilities produce, it's the scale at which they produce it. A conventional Western refinery might process 200,000 to 400,000 barrels per day and focus almost entirely on fuel outputs. China's integrated petrochemical complexes routinely process over 400,000 barrels per day and capture value at every single stage of the process. Nothing is wasted. Every byproduct becomes a feedstock for the next stage. The economic efficiency of these facilities doesn't just outcompete Western refineries. It makes them structurally obsolete. And then came the next generation, the Yulong Refinery Complex in Shandong Province. A $20 billion facility currently in advanced development is designed to process over 400,000 barrels per day at full capacity while simultaneously operating one of the largest integrated petrochemical platforms on Earth. This isn't an upgrade to existing infrastructure. This is China announcing, in concrete and steel, that it intends to extend its lead so far beyond the competition that catching up becomes a mathematical impossibility. Then there's the HAPCO complex in Panjin, backed not by a Chinese state enterprise, but by Saudi Aramco itself. The world's largest crude producer chose to embed itself inside China's refining empire rather than compete with it. That decision alone tells you everything you need to know about where global energy power actually resides in 2026. What China built isn't a fuel industry. It's the backbone of modern material civilization, and it all runs through Chinese infrastructure. But the state giants and the mega complexes are only part of the story. Because running parallel to all of this, quietly and relentlessly, was a second refining system that Beijing never fully advertised: China's shadow refineries. While the world was watching Sinopec and PetroChina build their gleaming mega complexes, something else was happening in Shandong Province that almost nobody in the Western energy establishment was taking seriously. Scattered across the coastline and industrial zones of China's most oil-obsessed region, hundreds of small, independent refineries were quietly humming away, processing crude that the rest of the world refused to touch. These are the teapot refineries, and they are one of the most ingenious strategic assets any nation has ever accidentally built. The name comes from their shape: small, squat, with a single smokestack that resembles a teapot spout. Individually, they're unremarkable. A typical teapot might process 40,000 to 100,000 barrels per day, a fraction of what a state megacomplex handles. But there are hundreds of them, and when you add their capacity together, you're looking at a shadow refining network that contributes millions of barrels per day to China's total throughput. A network that operates on entirely different economics than anything the state giants touch. Here's what makes them genuinely dangerous. The teapots run on sanctioned crude. Iranian oil that no European refiner will touch. Russian crude that Western majors abandoned after 2022. Venezuelan barrels that have nowhere else to go. Because these crudes are locked out of mainstream markets, they trade at steep discounts, sometimes $15, $20, even $30 below international benchmark prices. The teapots buy them at the discount, process them, and sell the refined output into the domestic Chinese market or regional export channels. The margin economics are brutal and beautiful at the same time. But this was just the beginning of what made the teapot system so strategically significant. What China ended up with, not entirely by design, but absolutely by tolerance, was a two-tier refining architecture that no other nation on Earth possesses. When global crude prices spike and margins tighten, the state giants optimize. When sanctioned barrels flood the market at a discount, the teapots absorb them. The two systems don't compete with each other. They complement each other. Together, they give China a processing resilience that is essentially unbreakable because there is no supply disruption, no geopolitical shock, No sanctions regime that can simultaneously neutralize both tiers at once. And the West handed China this advantage for free. Every sanctions package slapped on Iran, Russia, and Venezuela pushed more discounted crude directly into the hands of Shandong's independent processors. The harder the pressure, the cheaper the feedstock, the more profitable the teapots became. China didn't build the teapot system as a strategic weapon, but it absolutely recognized what it had, and it protected it. When international pressure mounted to shut the teapots down, Beijing looked the other way. Because a government that understands energy as a national security asset doesn't dismantle its own resilience for the sake of optics. The teapots are still running, the discounted crude is still flowing, and China's total processing capacity keeps climbing. But raw capacity, no matter how impressive, only becomes true power when it flips into something else entirely. Numbers that shouldn't exist. At some point, a statistic stops being a statistic and starts being a statement. And when you line up what China has built in refining capacity over the last 25 years, what you're looking at isn't industrial progress. It's a declaration. 14.75 million barrels of crude processed every single day. That's not a peak figure. That's not a record set once during a demand surge. That's China's routine daily throughput in 2026, a number it has now broken for the third consecutive year. For context, that single figure exceeds the total crude production of every OPEC member except Saudi Arabia. You heard that right. China processes more oil every day than Iraq pumps, than the UAE extracts, than Kuwait pulls from the ground. It doesn't produce that crude, it processes it. And that distinction is exactly where China's power lives. But the capacity numbers are where it gets truly staggering. China has added more refining capacity in the last 15 years than most OPEC nations produce in total. Crude output. The United States, the country that invented the modern refinery, has not built a single major new refining facility since the 1970s. Europe has been closing refineries for a decade. Japan is running aging infrastructure on declining domestic demand, and China has been building, relentlessly, systematically, at a pace that the Western energy establishment kept dismissing as overconstruction, right up until it became unchallengeable dominance. Then came the projects that made even the optimists in Beijing raise their eyebrows. The Yulong refinery complex in Shandong, $20 billion, over 400,000 barrels per day at full capacity. An integrated petrochemical platform so large it will single-handedly add processing muscle that rivals the entire refining capacity of several mid-sized nations. It isn't fully online yet, and it's already reshaping the regional energy calculus simply by existing. And then there's HAPCO in Panjin. This is the one that should have sent alarm bells ringing across every energy ministry in the world, because HAPCO isn't funded by Sinopec or PetroChina. It's backed by Saudi Aramco, the world's largest crude producer, who looked at the global refining landscape and decided that the smartest investment it could make was inside China's processing empire. When the country, sitting on the world's largest proven oil reserves, chooses to plant its flag inside your refinery system, you have stopped being a participant in the global energy market. You have become its infrastructure. The numbers don't lie. The construction schedules don't lie. And the foreign capital flowing into Chinese refining doesn't lie. China didn't stumble into this position. It built toward it, year after year, facility after facility, until the gap between itself and every other nation became too wide to close in any realistic time frame. But here's what all that capacity eventually created: a consequence so dramatic, so geopolitically loaded, that it completely changed the power dynamics of an entire continent. The flip that changed Asia. There's a moment in every arms race when one side crosses a threshold so significant that the entire nature of the competition changes. For China's refining build-out, that moment came quietly, without fanfare, without a press conference. But its consequences are still reverberating across every fuel market in Asia today. China built so much refining capacity that it ran out of domestic demand to fill it. Think about what that means. A country of 1.4 billion people, running the world's second largest economy, with hundreds of millions of vehicles on its roads and thousands of factories burning fuel around the clock, and its refineries were still producing more gasoline, diesel, and jet fuel than the entire country could consume. The overcapacity that Western analysts had been dismissing as an inefficiency, a miscalculation, a symptom of state-directed overbuilding turned out to be the most strategically consequential decision China ever made. Because when you produce more refined product than your domestic market absorbs, you don't shut the refineries down. You export. And that's exactly what China did. Quietly, steadily, and then at massive scale, China flipped from being a net importer of refined petroleum products to a dominant regional exporter. Fuel that used to flow into China from South Korean, Japanese, and Singaporean refineries now flows outward from Chinese facilities into the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, and across Southeast Asia. The direction of the trade completely reversed, and with it, the direction of the power. But this was just the beginning of what that flip actually meant. When you supply a region's fuel, you don't just sell them a commodity. You embed yourself into their infrastructure. You become the variable that their logistics systems, their agricultural supply chains, their military fuel reserves, and their civilian transport networks are all calibrated around. Southeast Asian nations didn't sit down and consciously decide to become dependent on Chinese refined products. They simply bought the cheapest, most available fuel in the market, and China made sure that fuel was Chinese. The dependency built itself, silently, incrementally, one quarterly supply contract at a time. And Beijing watched it happen with perfect clarity. Because a government that has spent 25 years treating refining capacity as a national security asset doesn't accidentally become the regional fuel supplier. It engineers that outcome, and then it waits for the moment when the dependency becomes undeniable. By 2025, Southeast Asia's reliance on Chinese refined product exports had reached levels that no regional energy ministry wanted to say out loud. The pipelines, the shipping routes, the supply contracts, they all pointed in the same direction, toward China, toward Chinese refineries, toward Chinese state enterprises that answered, ultimately, to Beijing. The tap was fully open. The region was drinking from it. And nobody had seriously asked what would happen if Beijing decided, for any reason at all, to turn it off. Then came March 2026, and the world got its answer. When the tap closed March 2026. Tensions in the Strait of Hormuz had been escalating for weeks. Shipping insurance premiums were spiking, tanker operators were rerouting, and the global crude market was already on edge. Then Beijing made a decision that, on the surface, looked like a cautious domestic policy response to supply uncertainty. China's government ordered a temporary halt to refined fuel exports. No dramatic announcement, no ultimatum, just a quiet directive to state enterprises to prioritize domestic supply until the situation stabilized. The reaction across Southeast Asia was immediate. And it was nothing short of panic. Within 72 hours of China's export halt, fuel wholesale prices across the Philippines spiked so sharply that the government in Manila had no choice but to act. The Philippines declared a national energy emergency, a designation the country hadn't used in over a decade. Fuel rationing discussions began at the cabinet level. Long queues formed at petrol stations in Luzon and Mindanao as distributors stopped restocking, uncertain when the next Chinese supply shipment would arrive or whether it would arrive at all. But it wasn't just the Philippines. Malaysia, a crude oil producer in its own right, a country that sits on its own offshore reserves, told civil servants to work from home to conserve fuel. You heard that right. A nation that pumps its own oil was rationing refined products because its refining infrastructure had quietly become calibrated around Chinese export supply. The irony was almost too stark to process. Malaysia had the crude. China had the capacity to turn it into something usable. And without that capacity, even the producers were exposed. Vietnam tightened fuel distribution controls within days. Indonesia accelerated emergency procurement conversations with alternative suppliers, conversations that revealed almost immediately how few credible alternatives actually existed at the volume and speed Southeast Asia required. Singapore, the regional trading hub, watched spot prices for diesel and jet fuel climb to levels not seen since the post-pandemic supply chaos of 2022. Then came the most devastating realization of all. This wasn't a crisis caused by a war. It wasn't caused by a natural disaster, a pipeline rupture, or a tanker blockage. It was caused by one government issuing one internal directive to its own state enterprises. No shots fired, no sanctions imposed, no international incident formally declared. Beijing hadn't weaponized its refining capacity, it had simply prioritized itself. And that single act of self-prioritization had triggered energy emergencies across multiple sovereign nations simultaneously. The entire region had just been handed a live demonstration of what dependency actually looks like when the dependent party finally feels it. Every energy ministry in Southeast Asia that had spent the previous decade buying cheap Chinese refined products without asking hard questions about supply security was now staring at the answer to the question they never asked. China didn't need to threaten anyone. It didn't need to make demands. It simply paused, and the tremors were felt from Manila to Kuala Lumpur to Hanoi. And when you understand what that moment actually represented, the entire 25-year story snaps into focus in a way that is impossible to unsee. The campaign that won here's what the last 25 years actually were. Not an industrial development program. Not an economic growth strategy. Not even an energy security initiative. At least not in the narrow sense that Western policymakers use that phrase. What China executed, with a patience and strategic clarity that is genuinely rare in the history of any nation, was a campaign to make itself the irreplaceable node in the global energy processing network. The one entity that cannot be removed without everything else breaking. And the Hormuz crisis just proved, in real time, that the campaign succeeded completely. Think about what irreplaceable actually means in this context. The United States can be sanctioned. Russian crude can be embargoed. Iranian exports can be blocked. Saudi Arabia can cut production. Every major player in the global energy system can be pressured, isolated, or bypassed because alternatives exist, or can be constructed, or can be negotiated into existence. But you cannot bypass the refinery. You cannot sanction the facility that turns unusable crude into the diesel your trucks run on and the jet fuel your aircraft burn. And when one country controls nearly 50% of an entire continent's refining capacity, there is no alternative to construct. There is no bypass to negotiate. There is only the tap and the hand that holds it. China holds the tap. But here's what makes this story genuinely different from every other tale of geopolitical leverage you've ever heard. China didn't seize this position. It wasn't taken by force or coercion or threat. Every nation in Southeast Asia chose Chinese refined products freely because they were cheaper, more available, and more reliable than the alternatives. Every foreign energy company that signed supply contracts with Chinese state enterprises did so because the economics made sense. Saudi Aramco didn't back the Hapco complex in Panjin because Beijing twisted its arm. It did so because China's refining infrastructure is the most strategically valuable processing real estate on the planet, and Aramco wanted inside it. The world walked into this dependency with its eyes open. It just never looked far enough down the road to see where the walking would end. And now, cast your mind back to the year 2000. The United States, Western Europe, and Japan controlling half the world's refining capacity. China processing a fraction of what it needed, dependent on foreign infrastructure, invisible on the global refining map. A nation that the energy establishment treated as a developing market. Interesting, growing, but not serious. Not yet. 25 years. That's all it took. 25 years of state-directed capital, integrated mega-complexes, teapot refineries running sanctioned crude at steep discounts, record throughput years stacked on top of each other, and a quiet, relentless accumulation of regional export dependency that nobody in Southeast Asia fully confronted until the moment Beijing paused its export taps and the Philippines declared a national emergency within 72 hours. 14.75 million barrels a day, nearly 50% of Asia's entire processing capacity. The Yulong complex is still coming online. Hapco is still scaling up. The teapots are still running. The throughput records are still falling. China didn't become the world's biggest oil processing superpower by accident. It decided to in a room in Beijing sometime in the late 1990s when the math became too terrifying to ignore. The rest of the world just didn't get the memo. And by the time the Hormuz crisis delivered it, there was nothing left to do but read it.